Welcome back to Revise and Resubmit for another weekend book review.
Weekend book review, great.
This week we're taking a deep dive into Morris Eagle's subjective experience, perspectives from psychology, psychoanalysis, neuroscience, and philosophy.
Oh, interesting.
It's a fascinating look at something we all experience, but rarely stop to think about what it feels like to have thoughts and emotions and sensations.
You're absolutely right. It's like we're constantly living through our subjective experiences. But we don't often step back and examine the nature of that experience itself.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Eagle does a fantastic job.
He does.
Of guiding us through that examination.
Yeah.
Drawing on insights from psychology, psychoanalysis, neuroscience, and philosophy.
Oh, wow.
He even starts by pointing out how often these fields, even the ones specifically dedicated to studying the mind, have struggled to really grasp the essence of subjective experience.
Right. That really struck me too. The fact that even psychology went through phases of practically ignoring subjective experience.
Holy.
Like with behaviorism.
Yeah.
They were so focused on observable behavior that they treated the mind like a black box.
It's almost like they were trying to study the mind without actually acknowledging the mindness of it all,
Precisely.
Yeah.
And while cognitive psychology did acknowledge the mind, they often focused on unconscious processes, the mental machinery that operates beneath our awareness.
Eagle uses the example of size constancy to illustrate this point.
Right. Yeah.
How we see a car is the same size, whether it's right next to us or far down the road.
Yeah.
Even though the image on our retina is getting smaller, we do all these complex calculations and adjustments without even realizing it.
And that leads to a rather unsettling question.
Oh, okay.
If so much of our mental life is happening outside of our conscious awareness, how much agency do we really have? That's where Eagle's exploration of the illusion of agency comes in.
Okay.
Yeah.
This is where things start to get seriously mind-bending.
Yeah.
Is he saying that we're not actually making choices?
Well,
that it's all just an illusion?
He presents some pretty compelling evidence that our sense of conscious control might be more of a story we tell ourselves after the action has already taken place.
He talks about the stocking study.
Right, exactly.
Where people unconsciously preferred the rightmost stocking.
Right.
But then came up with all these elaborate reasons for their choice.
Yeah.
As if they'd made a deliberate decision based on those reasons.
Exactly.
And think about how often we do that in our own lives.
Right.
We think we know why we did something.
But
when we really examine it,
there
might be all sorts of unconscious factors at play.
It's kind of humbling to realize how much of our decision-making might be influenced by things we're not even aware of.
And it gets even more intriguing when Eagle brings in Libet's experiment, where brain activity seemed to precede conscious decisions, further challenging our notion of free will. I'm sure you've heard about it.
Yeah.
It's been widely discussed and debated.
It definitely makes you question whether free will is as straightforward as we tend to assume.
Now, before we dive into the psychoanalytic perspective on subjective experience, let's take a moment to appreciate how Eagle sets the stage in the preface and introduction.
Right.
Christopher Christian,
the
editor of Psychoanalytic Psychology, really praises Eagle.
He does.
For tackling such a complex issue in a clear and rigorous way.
He's a very clear writer.
Yes. Christian even predicts the book will become a classic.
Oh, wow.
And from what we've seen so far, I can totally see why.
What's so great is that Eagle doesn't shy away from critiquing and even debunking some common assumptions about subjective experience.
Interesting.
He draws on such a wide range of research and perspective, creating a truly comprehensive analysis.
And in the introduction, he highlights this fascinating paradox.
Okay.
Consciousness and the ability to experience are arguably the most fundamental aspects of being human.
Yes.
Yet they've been kind of mishandled by the very fields that study the mind.
Right.
It's like the mind itself is trying to study the mind.
Yeah.
And it's not an easy task.
It's not.
But Eagle dives right into that challenge.
He does.
Exploring how different disciplines have grappled with the slippery nature of subjective experience.
And he doesn't stop there.
Oh, okay.
He goes on to explore how psychoanalysis, a field often associated with the unconscious, has also tried to understand subjectivity.
It seems like a contradiction.
Yeah, it does.
But it's actually a really rich area of exploration.
And that's where we'll pick up in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay.
We'll unravel how psychoanalysis tries to make sense of subjective experience, even when dealing with mental content hidden from conscious awareness.
Stay tuned.
Yes. Welcome back to Revise and Resubmit,
where we're continuing our deep dive into the fascinating world of subjective experience.
And, we ended the last part on a bit of a cliffhanger.
Oh, did we?
How does psychoanalysis, a field often associated with the unconscious,
right,
grapple with something as personal and nuanced as subjectivity?
It's a good question, because on the surface,
yeah,
it does seem like a contradiction.
Right.
But, as Eagle points out,
yeah,
psychoanalysis has sometimes been called a science of subjectivity.
Right.
And that's despite the fact that it deals with mental content that's often hidden.
Yeah.
Even from the person experiencing it.
It's a complex relationship for sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And Eagle really dives into those complexities.
He does.
He highlights how challenging it is to study subjective experience within a psychoanalytic framework.
Right.
Especially when you're dealing with concepts like repression and the dynamic unconscious.
Yeah.
Those aren't exactly easy things to observe or measure objectively.
You hit the nail on the head there.
Yeah.
It's a tricky business.
Sure.
And Eagle doesn't shy away from pointing out the potential pitfalls, particularly the issue of suggestion.
Ah, yes. The idea that analysts, even with the best intentions, might subtly lead patients to report experiences that fit a bit too neatly into psychoanalytic theory.
Precisely, it's a valid concern.
Yeah.
And one that underscores the need for rigorous methodology and a healthy dose of skepticism in the field.
Okay.
It's a reminder that we need to be cautious about interpreting subjective experiences through any theoretical lens,
right,
no matter how compelling it might seem.
Okay, so with all those challenges in mind,
yeah,
how does Eagle approach the psychoanalytic study of subjective experience?
That's where it gets interesting.
Okay.
He actually takes a bit of a detour from the traditional Freudian emphasis on those deeply buried, sometimes bizarre unconscious fantasies.
Oh, interesting.
Like Melanie Klein's work on children's aggressive fantasies.
Yeah, those are pretty intense.
Those are pretty intense.
Those interpretations always make me wonder how much is actually going on in a child's mind versus how much is being projected onto them by the theory.
That's a valid point.
Yeah.
And Eagle seems to share some of those reservations.
Yes.
Instead of digging for those deep hidden fantasies,
yeah,
he proposes a different way of thinking about consciousness as a continuum, rather than a strict division between conscious and unconscious.
A continuum.
Yeah.
So it's not like there's this hard line separating what we're aware of and what we're not.
Exactly. It's more like a gradient,
okay,
with different levels of awareness.
Interesting.
He uses the terms focal and fringe,
okay,
to describe different areas of this continuum.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Can you give me an example of how that works?
Sure. Imagine the word moon.
Okay.
When you hear that word.
Yeah.
It triggers not only the dictionary definition in your mind, but also a whole web of personal associations, memories, emotions, a sort of halo of meaning.
Yeah.
And many of those associations might be in the fringe of your awareness.
Okay.
You're not fully conscious of them.
Right.
But they can still influence your thoughts and feelings.
Wow, that's a really helpful way to visualize it.
Right.
It's like a spotlight shining on the word moon. And then there's this surrounding glow that represents all those subtle fringe associations.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
And this concept of a continuum of consciousness has really important implications for how we think about therapy.
Oh, okay.
Instead of searching for those deeply repressed, potentially traumatic memories,
right,
maybe the focus should shift towards bringing those fringe associations into focus.
Okay.
Making the patient more aware of the subtle forces shaping their thoughts and feelings.
So instead of digging for buried treasure, we're helping illuminate the shadows.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it allows for a more nuanced and collaborative approach to therapy.
Nice.
Instead of the therapist acting as a detective uncovering hidden truths,
Right.
they become more of a guide,
Okay.
helping the patient explore the landscape of their own mind.
Can you give an example of how this might play out in a therapy session?
Absolutely. Eagle describes the case of a male patient who experiences intense anxiety after achieving success in his career.
Okay.
Now, a traditional psychoanalytic interpretation might focus on uncovering a deep-seated Oedipal fear.
Yeah.
The idea that he unconsciously fears surpassing his father and facing retribution.
Yeah, I can see how that classic interpretation might fit.
Right. But Eagle suggests that the anxiety might stem from something less dramatic.
Okay.
A more nuanced, implicit association in the fringe of consciousness between achievement and harming his father.
Okay.
Maybe there were subtle messages he received growing up, or perhaps he witnessed his father struggling with his own success.
So instead of positing this deep unconscious death wish,
Right.
we're looking at the subtle web of associations and how they might be shaping his current experience.
Precisely. And it doesn't require the patient to believe in any specific interpretation.
Okay.
It's more about exploring those connections and seeing how they resonate with his own lived experience.
I can see how that would be much less intimidating for the patient, too.
Right.
It feels less like you're being analyzed and more like you're collaborating in a process of self-discovery.
Exactly. And it emphasizes the agency of the patient.
Right.
They're not just a passive recipient of interpretations, but an active participant in understanding their own minds.
This is fascinating stuff. It really makes you think about how much of our experience is shaped by things we're not even fully aware of.
Absolutely. And it highlights the importance of cultivating self-awareness and paying attention to those subtle whispers from the fringe of our consciousness.
Now, speaking of understanding others, Eagle also delves into the world of intersubjective experience.
Right, where we move beyond our own internal world and grapple with how we perceive and understand other minds. This is where things get even more interesting.
Because it's one thing to try to understand our own subjective experience, but it's a whole other challenge to try and understand what's going on inside someone else's head.
You got it. And Eagle starts this exploration by pointing out a major limitation of traditional psychoanalytic theories.
What's that?
Their tendency to view the other primarily as an instrument, a means to an end.
Can you give an example of that?
Sure, like in Freud's drive theory, where the object of our drive is simply a means to satisfy our instinctual needs.
Okay.
Or in Kohut's self-psychology, where the self-object serves primarily to bolster our sense of self.
So it's like we're using other people to meet our own needs.
Exactly.
Rather than seeing them as fully formed individuals with their own inner worlds.
Eagle calls this the instrumentalist conception of the other.
Okay.
And he argues that it limits our understanding of the richness and complexity of human relationships.
I can see how that would be a problem. If we're always viewing others through the lens of our own needs,
Right.
we're not really seeing them for who they are.
Precisely. And it can lead to all sorts of misunderstandings and conflicts in our relationship.
Okay, so if the instrumentalist view is so limited, how do we move beyond it? What does Eagle suggest?
He proposes that we need a model that accounts for our innate capacity for empathy and understanding other minds. A model that recognizes the other as a truly distinct subject with their own inner world.
That makes sense. But how do we actually do that?
Right.
How do we get inside someone else's head and understand their subjective experience?
Well, that's where the concept of mentalization comes in.
Okay.
It's our natural ability to understand others as having minds like our own, to recognize that they have thoughts, feelings, beliefs, desires, just like we do.
So it's like we're putting ourselves in their shoes, trying to see the world from their perspective.
Exactly. And this ability develops early in life, as evidenced by research showing how infants respond differently to intentional actions compared to random movements.
You mean like how a baby will get excited when you play peekaboo?
Exactly.
Because they understand that you're intentionally hiding and reappearing.
Exactly. Even babies seem to have an intuitive grasp that other beings have goals and intentions.
That's amazing. So mentalization is this basic ability to understand that others have minds, but is that all there is to it?
Well, Eagle distinguishes mentalization from a more sophisticated ability, a reflective function.
Reflective function, what's that?
It's the capacity to not only recognize that others have mental states,
Wow.
but also to reflect on those mental states, both our own and others.
Okay.
And consider their accuracy and complexity.
I see.
It's like taking mentalization to the next level.
Okay.
Adding a layer of self-awareness and critical thinking to our understanding of minds.
So it's not just about putting ourselves in someone else's shoes.
Right.
It's about thinking critically about what we see when we're in those shoes.
Exactly. And it's crucial for navigating the complexities of human relationships. He uses the example of patients with borderline personality disorder,
Okay.
who are often very skilled at mentalizing, attributing thoughts and feelings in others.
They can easily imagine what someone else might be thinking or feeling.
Yes, but they struggle to reflect on the accuracy of their attributions,
Oh.
leading to intense emotional reactions and interpersonal difficulties.
I see.
They might assume someone is angry with them without checking if that's actually true.
Uh-huh.
Or they might misinterpret a neutral comment as a personal attack.
So they're good at understanding that others have minds, but they struggle to accurately assess those minds and to regulate their own emotional responses.
Precisely, which highlights the importance of reflective function.
Yeah.
While mentalization might be our starting point.
Right.
Reflective function seems crucial for navigating the complexities of human relationships and regulating our own emotions.
This is really thought-provoking. It makes you wonder how good we are at reflecting on our own mental states.
Right. Could improving the skill help us manage our emotions better and build stronger, more understanding relationships?
Okay.
It's a fascinating question to consider.
It definitely makes you want to pay more attention to those internal conversations we have with ourselves and how they might be shaping our interactions with others.
Absolutely. And it brings us to the final part of Eagle's exploration of subjective experience. His fascinating take on feelings and effects.
Okay, I'm ready to dive into that. I'm ready to dive into that. Let's explore how feelings fit into this whole conversation.
Yeah, feelings are interesting. And Eagle points out that they've often been neglected in psychology's quest for scientific rigor.
Oh, really?
It's like they're seen as too messy or subjective to study in a truly objective way.
Because how do you measure a feeling?
Right.
It's not like you can put it under a microscope.
Exactly, but Eagle makes a compelling case for why we can't afford to ignore feelings. He reminds us that they're not just frivolous add-ons to our mental lives.
Okay.
They're powerful motivators that shape our behavior.
Okay, I could see that we don't just do things randomly.
Right.
Our actions are often driven by how we feel.
Precisely. He uses simple examples like thirst and hunger to illustrate this point.
Yeah.
We don't just drink water because our bodies need to maintain fluid balance.
Yeah.
We drink because we feel the unpleasant sensation of thirst,
Right.
and we seek the pleasurable relief of quenching it.
So feeling thirsty actually motivates us to take action to grab a glass of water and drink.
Right.
It's not just a passive experience.
Exactly. And Eagle argues that this motivational power of feelings is often obscured when we focus solely on the evolutionary function of a behavior.
Oh.
It's like we get so caught up in the why of a behavior from an evolutionary perspective that we overlook the immediate subjective experience that's driving it in the moment.
Can you give me an example of that?
Sure, let's take eating.
Right.
From an evolutionary standpoint, eating serves the purpose of providing energy for survival.
Right.
But in the moment, we eat because we feel hungry and we enjoy the taste of food.
Right.
Those immediate feelings are what actually motivate us to seek out food and eat it.
So it's like there's this disconnect between the long-term evolutionary explanation and the immediate subjective experience.
Exactly. And Eagle argues that traditional psychoanalysis, with its focus on instinctual drives,
doesn't fully account for this motivational primacy of feelings. The classic psychoanalytic model often portrays the ego as this rational mediator trying to control these unruly impulses.
So it's like our instincts are these wild horses,
Right.
and our rational mind is trying to rein them in.
That's a great analogy.
Right.
But Eagle suggests that this model diminishes the importance of conscious feelings as motivators in their own right.
I see.
It's not just about taming our base instincts.
Right.
Our feelings themselves can drive our actions in powerful ways.
And that makes sense when you think about it.
Yeah.
We often make decisions based on how we feel, even if those feelings don't seem entirely rational.
Right. And even within psychoanalysis, there's recognition of this power of feelings. Eagle quotes Fennekel, a prominent Freudian theorist, who acknowledges that defense mechanisms are ultimately motivated by the desire to avoid painful feelings.
Really?
We don't just repress memories or thoughts for no reason.
Yeah.
We do it because it feels safer or less painful than confronting them directly. So even those unconscious defense mechanisms are driven by feelings. That's fascinating.
It is. And Eagle also brings in insights from affective neuroscience,
Okay.
a field that's using brain imaging techniques to understand the neural processes underlying feelings and emotions.
So we're actually starting to get a glimpse of what's happening in the brain when we experience different feelings.
Exactly. And this research is revealing how different brain regions work together to create and regulate our emotional responses.
Interesting.
For example, studies show that the amygdala, a brain region often associated with fear and other negative emotions, can be modulated by the prefrontal cortex, which is involved in planning and decision-making.
So it's not like we're just slaves to our emotions.
Right.
There's this interplay between different brain regions that allows for some degree of control.
Precisely. And this brings us back to the concept of reflective function, which we discussed earlier.
Right.
Eagle suggests that this ability to reflect on our feelings, understand their origins, and consider alternative interpretations plays a key role in managing our emotional lives.
So instead of just reacting impulsively based on how we feel, we can pause and think about why we're feeling that way and whether there might be other ways to interpret the situation.
Exactly. And that pause, that space for reflection,
Yeah.
can make all the difference in how we respond to challenging situations and how we manage our emotions.
This has been such a rich exploration of subjective experience. I feel like I have a whole new appreciation for how complex and multifaceted it really is.
I agree. And Eagle wraps up his book by emphasizing the need for multiple approaches to investigate this fascinating phenomenon. He argues that we need carefully designed experiments and qualitative research introspection and a healthy dose of skepticism. It's not about finding one right answer. It's about embracing the complexity and continually refining our understanding.
And he leaves us with a really thought-provoking question. What if we could perfectly map someone's subjective experience to their brain activity? Would that eliminate the feeling of agency? Or is the experience itself something separate, something science can't fully capture?
It's a question that really pushes us to the edge of what we know about the mind and consciousness.
Yeah.
It suggests that there might be more to subjective experience than just the firing of neurons.
Right.
That there's something ineffable, something that might always remain a mystery.
It's both humbling and exciting to think about all the questions we still have about the nature of our own experience.
Right.
And it makes me appreciate Eagle's willingness to dive into those questions, even when there are no easy answers.
Absolutely. This book is a testament to the power of curiosity and the importance of staying open to multiple perspectives.
Well, a huge thank you to Morris Eagle for writing such a thought-provoking and insightful book, and to Routledge for publishing it. It's been a real pleasure to deep dive into these ideas with you.
The pleasure was all mine, and a big thank you to all our listeners for joining us on this journey.
If you enjoyed this deep dive into subjective experience, be sure to subscribe to Revise and Resubmit on Spotify, Amazon Music, and Apple Podcasts. We have plenty more fascinating books lined up to explore with you.
Until next time, keep those minds curious and those conversations flowing.